Hi there, Ryan Koyman here today for Technician's Toolbox. Today's tech tip is going to be dealing with misfiring Fords, locating which cylinder is misfiring and identifying the cause of the misfire. This seems to be an area where a lot of techs have confusion. It's not like a GM where we have misfire counters that we can rely on. On a vehicle here such as today's 2008 Ford Focus, which has a 4-cylinder, we might be able to pull each coil individually and test it with a spark tester the old-fashioned way. However, what do you do if you have a V8, V10? You're not going to spend all day pulling coils and testing them individually. So that's where I have some great tech tips for you here that can be done no problem by any technician. First off, we're going to start out using the Ford factory scan tool here. If a user is fortunate enough to have this IDS, it gives us a great feature here to use called Power Balance. I'm going to pull up the Power Balance screen. Now it's going to identify the firing order and give me a chart here indicating which cylinder has a low contribution. And as we can see here from the chart, it's cylinder number 2. Now let's say we have intermittent misfire. Also gives us a gray trace showing us the history, so it's I'd rather say painfully obvious which cylinder is misfiring here. Okay, let's say you don't have the factory scan tool for this Ford. We can use any generic scan tool, go into the mode 6 function of that scan tool and identify misfires as well. Typically on today's newer vehicles it's going to be TID 53. On some older vehicles it may be TID 51. However, the key element is each cylinder is going to be individually identified. So my tip to you is go in and look for TIDs 51 or 53 and look for the SIDs 1 through 10 is going to show us where the misfire is. Here again I'm going to use the IDS, go into mode 6. And we're going to scroll through here a little bit, get down to the misfire section. I'm going to hit my refresh button so we get the current data. And there again, mode 6 tells us cylinder number 2 misfire. We're at 24%. So the fail rate on this to set a DTC has to be 34%. So that's why we don't have a P0302. We might have a P0300, or we may have no code at all. I've seen that in many vehicles we've been testing here today where it's not setting a code as we would expect it to. However, mode 6 does pick it up, and this failure will stay in there at least for the last 10 drive cycles. So it's very important for tech to use this to identify a history misfire as well. Okay, for our final testing method today, I'm using a lab scope here to watch the current amperage draw of the ignition system. First off, I have channel 1 of my lab scope back probed into the ignition control side of the primary circuit on the ignition coil number 1. Basically all this is going to do is act as a sync, so I know exactly when number 1 cylinder fires. Channel 2 of the lab scope, I'm using my low current probe with a jumper wire in place of the fuse here, and what I'm going to be doing is watching the amperage of every time ignition coil fires. I'm going to look at the lab scope here and bear in mind your typical 4-cylinder firing pattern is 1, 3, 4, 2. So now here we have the pattern pulled up on the lab scope. We have number 1 indicated. I'm triggering on number 1 cylinder. Now we follow along with that. We have cylinders 1, 3, 4, and 2. And now it's very obvious here. We're looking at the triple strike ignition here used on Ford from idle up to 1600 RPMs. Our initial spike looks okay. However, if you note, it drops down below. We have tails on this amperage pattern, and the second and third spike are considerably lower than the other ones. This doesn't tell me exactly what's wrong, but it sure as heck highlights which cylinder the problem is at. Now, just for interesting, let's look at elevated RPMs and see the elimination of the triple strike. I'm bringing the RPMs up. There, as we get above 1600 RPMs, I'm around 2500 right now. Let's bring it back down a little bit. Notice how we lost that triple strike ignition. However, you still see the tail indicated in the lab scope pattern, letting us know there's definitely an issue with number 2 in the cylinder. In conclusion, and to wrap things up here with diagnosing Ford random misfire codes, we've given you several different suggestions. You could go with the old low-tech method of testing each coil individually with a spark tester. You could use the IDS, the factory scan tool, in the power balance function to graph out your misfires, or you could use any generic scan tool in mode 6 to pinpoint which cylinder is misfiring. And finally, as I showed you here with a 2-channel lab scope and a low current probe, we can pinpoint exactly which cylinder is misfiring. Gives technicians a good direction and to go with their diagnosis.